In this quick tutorial, I want to talk about how we can optimize this game mesh to not only be less polygons or tries, but also looks much smoother. So here's the original mesh that we had. As you see here, a few different errors we had. They progressively get smaller, but also what's happening is the actual thickness of each one of these is getting smaller. So we're going to figure out a way to keep that thickness consistent, but also optimize it so therefore we aren't dealing with, in this case, 1,000 triangles, as you can see listed here. We rather have something much more optimized. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and just, in fact, I'm just going to start with a brand new scene. So I'm going to make a new scene, and I'm going to sacrifice our cube to the Blender gods, and now we are going to go ahead and add in a new mesh. In this case, I'm going to use a cylinder. I'm going to see how wide I want to be. So let's say if I want to be 1 meter in radius, that's fine for me. I can do 32 vertices. Really not, the polygon's not too much of a concern at this point. I want to now just select my top face, and I'm going to delete all the other faces. Okay. And so now what I want to do from here is I want to inset this face, and I want to scale it down to wherever I believe is going to be the smallest, or where I want that center piece to be. And there you go. And then you can also move it up if I want to have this piece moved up. I'm not sure if I would or not, but I'm going to move that up. And so now what we have here is we have our disk for the middle. We have our outside ring. I want to add in this case 1. So now we have 2. So I'm going to add an additional 4 rings. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rings, and then we have that center ring as well, that center disk. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this middle disk, I'm going to separate it. So I'm just going to separate selection. And now I'm going to just go ahead and hide that middle disk for now. And I want to select these 5 outside rings and invert my selection. I want to remove, if I hold Control Backspace, I can, delete, I can dissolve, or I'm going to delete edges. And what we'll have left is we'll have all these edges left, and that's fine. We're going to use these edges to make up our rings. So to do this, I want to try to extrude each one of these rings, but right now they are mesh. I'm going to go to Object and convert them into a curve. And now that's going to give me these options right here. If I were to open up my Object App Properties, Geometry, I can go to Bevel. I'm going to raise the bevel to whatever I think is appropriate. So let's say in this case 0.2. I might jump up the resolution a bit. And then also I'm going to jump up my, not what I want to do. I'm going to also jump up the preview resolution. Maybe that'll help, maybe not. Okay, so this doesn't seem to be quite giving me the smoothest ring I want, but that's fine. We'll actually use our subdivision surface in a moment. But once I have this, as you see already, it's the same thickness consistently. So we aren't dealing with 5 different size rings, rather the thickness of rings is 5 different, kind of the radius is different, but the thickness remains consistent. So now with that, I'm going to go back to my object and convert mesh. And now I can add in a smooth modifier if I want. So subdivision surface, I'm going to put on 2 levels. There you go. Now we have that nice smooth one. Cool. So I'm going to now show my middle piece again. In this case, maybe I want to, perhaps I want to come here and raise up some of the middle part. So what I might do is I'm going to take this face, delete the face, face only, or only the face. And then we're just going to select this ring and do a grid fill. And there you go. So now I have some additional faces work with the middle here. I'm just going to select these 4 middle faces. I want to move it up. I want to move it up with the soft selection on space, something like that. That's fine. And then I can select all these edges and flatten those by disabling my soft selection. And just bring this down. Now to be flat. And now I want to also add shade smooth to this. If I want to, I can also add in a subdivision surface to make it even smoother. And that looks pretty good there. Okay, so now I want to move this in line. That I think that's pretty good. So now I have that part made up, and I do need to now make those little strips. So I'm just going to come in here and I can make a plane if I want. And maybe I'll just go ahead and smash that plane, something like that. Let's go ahead and bring it down a little more. So something like that. And I want my plane. So I'm selecting I divide my plane with a loop cut, and I'm just going to move this plane up so I can see it a little better. That looks pretty good. I want to just also adjust the pieces here. So something around that part. And then I'm going to add in a couple divisions here. So maybe something about here. That looks fine for me. And now it's just a matter of, let's go ahead and, man, I'm struggling right now. Let's go ahead and just grab some of these edges. I'm going to use my proportional editing again. And just move this down. Maybe I might even need to rotate a little bit. So something along that. And I can also come here and just try my proportional editing. Maybe I move each one of these into place. But I just want to make sure that it looks nice and smooth. Doesn't look too weird. Okay. And then I might come here one more time. Oop, I see it here is cutting through. So I want this just be above. And maybe I'm going to, I could add a subdivision surface modifier. Or maybe instead I'll just leave it as is. It's kind of up to your preference. But I think I'm fine with how it looks. I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate this and rotate it around. It may not be the fastest way to do it, but it works out pretty well. And then just duplicate one more time. Rotate it. Oops, let's rotate it. There you go. Now I have this grid made up. And of course, right now it's very high poly. So we need to join all these, and we need to make them a low poly version. So join this. I'm going to call this HP. That's pretty good. And now this is actually where it gets a little bit easier. I'm going to come in here and add a new plane. And I want to just do a subdivision surface. And I'm going to make this plane or subdivide one time. And I'm just going to scale it up until it covers everything here. And there you go, and that's what it does. And then we'll move this up until it's lined up with the, I guess you can line up with about here. And now the last thing I want to do is just go back to my front view. I'm going to move this up until it covers basically everything I want. So there you go, it looks pretty good. And now I'm going to hide my high poly. I just want to triangulate this, so I'm going to select everything here. I can go into, I guess be into faces and triangulate faces. So now this is a 8 triangles total compared to what we had before, which was 1002. And so now what I'm going to do here, then I'm just going to do a shade smooth. So I just right click and go shade smooth. And I want to also make sure that I can have this unwrap. So I'm going to go my object mode, apply my scale, and then go into the UV editing and just simply unwrap it. And that should look pretty nice. Okay, cool. So now we have our low poly. And this is the low poly plane. We have our high poly, which should look something like this. But the last thing we need to do here is we need to also make an ID map. So I'm going to actually duplicate my low poly here. I'm just going to call this ID, just like that. And now if I hide my low poly, I'm going to make two materials here. So my first material, I'm going to select my high poly, make a new material, and I'm just going to call this something like ID1. So it's just my ID maps. I meant to make it a base color of, let's say, this bright blue or this solid blue, right? And if I were to now go into my shading viewport, I can now see that blue. And then I'm going to make a second ID map. Or I'm going to select my ID map. I'm just going to go to a new material and call this ID2. And now I can make this like a nice red. And I might want to also, at this point, move the ID down a little bit. So therefore, you can see all the blues. And actually, at this point, it also might be nice to add in an additional subdivision surface, because ID map really isn't. It's just simply to show off the. It's supposed to simply to identify what needs to be moving. And so that looks pretty good there. I might also come in here and just crank this up a bit until it's, as you see there, now it's poking through. So let's move it down a little bit there. And then I'm also going to grab these edges and we'll move these down until, so I can see a little more of the blue. In fact, I also want to just scale this out a little bit and then move back down. So something like that. I just want to make sure I can see all of the blue. If that looks pretty good. Okay, so now we have both these out there. I want to go ahead and I'm going to export three things here. We have our HP, so I'm going to export the HP. In fact, I think I'll go ahead and select both the HP and the ID. And I'm going to export that out. And I'm just going to export FBX. I'm going to call that something along the lines of HP mesh. I guess HP grid is fine. And I want to make sure just to only select the objects. There you go. And then I want to deselect everything and just have my low poly. I'm going to export that out to FBX and just change the name from HP grid to LP grid for my low poly grid, and export just that selection. Now I'm going to open up my Substance Painter software and I'm going to import my LP low poly grid. Here it is. Nothing too special. My 8 triangles. That's all I got. Okay, and now I'm going to go to my baking mesh maps. And I might just make this a little bit higher just for the sake of this. Now I want to add in my high poly, so HP grid, and I want to crank up the front and the rear distance here. And I can also add my anti-aliasing if I want to. Other than that, though, let's go ahead and take a look at how this looks. Okay, let me look at my ID maps and see how the ID map came out. So we didn't quite get all the ID map we wanted. We are missing a part in the middle. So we can try to rebake this. Maybe we need to bring that back a bit. So let's go ahead and put this on 0.5. Let's try this again. Okay, so we still didn't get that. So that might just be a something we can adjust here. So maybe I will go ahead and add some thicknesses so I can just move it up if I want. Something like that. I might go ahead and just add me a little bit of thickness. So something along those lines perhaps. And now let's re-export this out. So export this one more time. And that happens sometimes where we have to kind of bounce between the two. And let's go back into our Substance Painter software and go ahead and go to Bake Mesh Maps. And let's remove what we had and add in the high poly again. And let's go ahead and bake this one last time. And there you go. You see the our grid our mesh baked in there. There, it looks pretty nice. Okay. So now what we just need to do here is I'm just going to drag on some kind of metal. Let's go steel rough. That looks good. Drop that in there. So I think it's already looking pretty decent. And now we want to make an opacity layer. So I'm just going to make sure that our shader setting allows for opacity. In this case, I did the alpha blending. And then I'm going to go my layers, add a new fill layer. And I need to first enable, so I've already made the shader that has opacity. Now I need to actually enable that opacity. So I need to go into my texture set settings, add to the channel opacity, And now if I were to make a new fill layer, I can disable everything except for my opacity. And I'm going to bring this opacity down to 0. And as you see on my left hand side, it has completely disappeared. But if I were to now right click and add mask with color selection, I'm going to color select the red. And as you see here, we now have this piece that has our high poly kind of grid baked on there with the opacity. And if we want to, we can also add in, perhaps we want to add in something like dust. So maybe I just come here, I add some kind of grayish to it with a lot of roughness. I can now add in black mask and then put in a generator there that is dirt, perhaps. And so now you see the right hand side is the UV map, the left hand side is the result we get. But yeah, so this is a really simple way of fooling the viewer to think they're seeing a very high poly mesh, but only at and this is only 8 triangles. So again, here's kind of what we started with, was something that was over 1,000 triangles versus what we have now, which is only 8 triangles. So using opacity and baking, kind of baking maps together really can combine for a incredibly powerful combination. So hopefully you guys can use this in your future projects, and hopefully you guys feel like you learned something of value today. Thanks.